So welcome to our Colleagues in Conversations, which is our chance to get together about monthly to explore issues in treatment and promote a deeper understanding of some of the work we do. Hosting this Colleagues in Conversations is an important way that we at Yellowbrick strive to stay connected to you, our colleagues. And this is especially important, of course, in times of COVID that we're hoping we're just gradually getting out of. As we start, I want to first thank Linda Kelly for stepping in for Tracy. This is interfacing with Zoom is something that Tracy's bailiwick, but Tracy's on vacation, so Linda's been kind enough to step in. So thank you, Linda. A couple of housekeeping items. If you want to ask questions as the talk goes along, please do so via chat. Then I'll monitor chat and ask the questions when there seems to be an appropriate break. And then after the question is asked, if you want to have a dialogue with Dr. Barron, then you can unmute yourself. But that's after the question is asked. Also, there will be a recording of this that in about a week, maybe 2 weeks, will be posted on a link will be on our website. And also, I think a YouTube gets put up. Before I go on to today's talk, I want to give you a brief preview of coming attractions. So our next Colleagues in Conversations, which will be in about 3 weeks, April 12th, will be Prudis Gorgajan, and she'll be talking about moral injury. And the working title for her talk is Understanding What's Right and Wrong in Assessing and Treating Moral Injury. Dr. Gorgajan is a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. She's a longtime friend of Yellowbrick and of Dr. Viner's, and she sits on the Yellowbrick board. And I think you'll find her a really deeply thoughtful person, and that should be a treat to have her talk about that compelling topic. The following month, May 17th, we'll be joined by Meredith Sonetz from Heartfelt Recovery. And Meredith is a board-certified interventionist and licensed first responder to families. And she's going to talk to us about interventions and family involvement in interventions and how we as professionals can work together for the best outcomes when these interventions take place. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce David Barron. He is our medical director at Yellowbrick, has been for I think about 10 years. Before coming to, he's a clinical assistant professor at Rosalind Franklin University of the Chicago Medical School. Before coming to Yellowbrick, for about 15 years, he was administrative psychiatrist and interim director of mental health services for the DuPage County Health Department. His clinical administrative experience and practice since he completed his training in 1989 has been within a developmental neurobiological understanding of mental illness. Over the course of his career, he has worked to understand mind and brain as different languages for the same essential human experience, including the complexity of neuroscience, the evolutionary basis of the human brain and behavior, and a deeply personal subjective experience of every individual. And I think you'll see in his talk how all of these three threads kind of weave in and out with each other. Dr. Barron is certified by the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology, and he is a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. He has served on the Ethics Committee of the Illinois Psychiatric Society as a member from 2001 to 2006, and as chairman from 2006 to 2011. I think you'll find Dr. Barron an especially engaging speaker. He brings a wit and sensibility that I've always found eminently relatable and fun to listen to. He'll talk today about working with patients with whom the patient-therapist interaction can be especially challenging and what the experience is like in trying to form a working alliance in these kind of situations for both the patient and importantly for the therapist. Okay, Dr. Barron.
Thank you. I will do my best to live up to that very kind introduction, Michael. So I thought that today we could talk about a case. And the reason I decided to present the case is that that's not usually what we do in these Colleagues in Conversations evenings. And It's relevant because I understand most, if not all, of the attendees to be involved in the mental health profession in some capacity. I know many in the past have been psychotherapists. And it turns out that even though what we do at Yellowbrick is a little bit specialized, and we are working with particularly treatment refractory folks for the most part, a lot of it is applicable to private practice and even to people who are not quite so treatment refractory. But some of the same principles, in fact, all of the same principles apply. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second is that while it is usual practice when you're talking about a case, especially in a presentation to an audience in a more public setting, to talk about your successes as compared to when you might meet with a small group in a consultation where you don't necessarily talk about your successes. You tend to talk about your challenges. I thought it'd be useful to talk about a case that was not our greatest success. I wouldn't say it was a complete flop, but it certainly didn't turn out optimally in the way everyone would have wished. And I think there are things to be learned from that, including the limitations of our field, because my experience at Yellowbrick, I've actually been medical director for more like about 6-7 years. I've been at Yellowbrick for 10 years, is that we have more available at our fingertips to be helpful to struggling emerging adults than anywhere I can conceive of, let alone know of. And we still can't successfully help every person who comes to us do something transformative. We're very ambitious in aiming for that with everybody. But of course, we're not going to succeed completely with everyone. And so I think it's useful to talk about, where do we still have things to learn? Where do we still have to learn more about the brain, more about the mind, and more about how to approach people in a way that can actually help them turn something around in their lives. So with that said, I'll get a little further into the slides. This is just our disclosure slide. We don't basically accept anything from industry. We just don't.
Dr. Barron, I'm not sure if the slide isn't showing on my screen.
Okay. Well, we probably have to turn on the slideshow for that, don't we? Sorry about that. Thank you, Michael. That better?
Yeah, it's there now.
Okay. All right. Let's try that again. Here I thought I was going to be so slick with the tech, It's just like treatment. It's messy. All right. We have no conflicts of interest. We don't take stuff from the industry of any kind. Just an acknowledgement. There are 3 of our staff, 2 former staff, who helped create a previous version of this presentation. Bryn Jessup, our Director of Family Services and Systems. David Duskovsky, staff emeritus and retired, and Mark Sandrolini, a child and adolescent psychiatrist who was with Yellowbrick for some years and moved on a couple of years ago. And my thanks to them for their parts of this presentation. So why call this resistance is futile? Some of you may know the reference. It's from Star Trek. There was a species called the Borg, these cybernetic organisms who would assimilate every culture they came across and make them into Borg. And of course, that's not what we do. But they had a phrase whenever they were taking over society, which was resistance is futile. You must join us. So in fact, I'm referring to resistance on both sides of the therapeutic relationship. Who is resistance futile for? Well, for the patient. Actually, resistance is sensible from the patient's point of view. Nobody wants to change. Change is hard. Change is painful. Our brains like to do what they know how to do, and they like to keep doing that. They do not want to do something different. And so being resistant to change, even if the change could be useful to you in your future, is an ordinary human experience, and it's a default human experience, and it reflects both well understood psychological models and it reflects brain function as we understand it. So our job is not to destroy resistance, is to help people see and experience how it can be less useful to be resistant and more useful to change. And what about for the therapist? Well, resistance is futile for the therapist, because when we go into intensive therapeutic relationships, which is what we do at Yellowbrick, we are going to feel things. We're going to have powerful emotional experiences. Traditionally, this was referred to as countertransference. We don't not use that phrase, but we have another model that accounts for it in a different way, and that's called enactment. And so we have a coherent model for our psychotherapy that helps us not only understand these emotional experiences in a somewhat different way than traditional countertransference, but also helps us use them as a therapeutic tool in a different way than traditional countertransference. And that, what we call that at Yellowbrick is the core enactment. Enactment theory comes from people like Alan Shore, Christina Alberini, and others who have researched the neurobiological interactions that occur between human beings when they are in a relationship, when they're in a conversation, in fact. This format that we're in now is very limiting in that regard, although it's not absent those qualities. We communicate with each other in lots of ways that are outside of our words. It goes through eye contact, facial expression, micro expressions, body language, tone, prosody of speech, that's the rhythm of your speech. And most of the time in most relationships, we don't spend a lot of time paying attention to our emotional experience that is a result of those communications. What we're trying to do within our psychotherapeutic model is pay very close attention to them and try to understand our emotional reactions and experiences in the context of the patient's experience. By the way, we use patient and client more or less interchangeably. Yellowbrick is a physician-owned organization, and it is a physician-led organization, so we tend to lean toward patient. I personally think of the word patient as a very honoring term. I understand there are other points of view in various fields about that, but to me, treating a patient is a very privileged relationship for the professional, and it's not about running their lives, it's about helping them to be supported in running their lives, to learn more about themselves, and to make better decisions. And I think of that across all medical and mental health practice. So while I know the history and understand some of the differences, I tend to use the word patient. So I'm sorry, our core enactment is how we attempt to crystallize a particular individual's repetitive patterns of behavior and engagement with others that have tended to be self-undermining, self-defeating, or even self-destructive. And it has its basis in a neurobiological understanding. It allows us to incorporate all the data we gather, not just the data from the interpersonal experiences, but data from behavioral history, from all the forms of acting out that at least the patients who come to us tend to have engaged in. And it actually gives us a clear path to use this information within a multimodal model. Very importantly, and for the purpose of this evening, this way of understanding and this mode of psychotherapy is applicable to any psychotherapeutic relationship. It's not at all limited to an intensive treatment program like Yellowbrick. So let's talk about the case. So this is a local audience. I will tell you that we have de-identified, changed details, certainly changed the name, ethnicity, all of that. If anyone feels like you recognize this person, you're probably mistaken. But if in fact you do, I just ask you to retain the confidence as we would treat this as a clinical consultation and maintain the privacy of the individual. We have not run into this before in presenting the case. We've gone to a lot of pains to de-identify. So this is a 19-year-old Italian-American. He is the youngest of 4 siblings, and he's the only male. When he came to Yellowbrick, he was recently discharged from a very prominent out-of-state psychiatric facility. A lot of our referrals come from such facilities. He's got multiple symptoms. He's depressed, he's anxious, he's been intermittently suicidal, very severe substance abuse, OCD symptoms, obsessive compulsive disorder, and social anxiety. He has felt coerced into treatment. I believe the previous hospitalization was involuntary. He found the hospital to be traumatic, which unfortunately many people do because of all the constraints and restrictions and exposure to a very regimented system that doesn't work well for a lot of people. And he feels coerced into treatment with us because his parents have said, right now Yellowbrick's the only thing we'll support financially. And as much as you'll learn, he's working to make his own living in a certain way. He doesn't have enough yet to fully live on his own. He also wants to be in school, and they won't support school until he finishes treatment. So he's under pressure. And he just says, I want some peace in my life, but the only way I get it is by using drugs. He has multiple diagnoses, you can see. That's only part of the list. Here's some more of the list. This is a person with a significant learning difficulty. In the traditional terms, he has a very wide verbal performance split in his IQ score. So his verbal IQ would have you believe, if you just sit and talk with him, that he's extremely intelligent and capable, but his capacity is very limited by the fact that he's not as good at other areas of executive function. He's quite depressed. He's not all that anxious, and you might say he's not really anxious enough for the degree of his difficulty and disability. Because that's a pretty low Beck score. These other scores have to do with dissociative experiences, amnesia, and then the last one is really important because it has to do with the activation of the limbic system. So he doesn't report a lot of subjective anxiety, but if you look at the symptoms related to anxiety, mostly bodily symptoms, and some other symptoms that people don't use the word anxiety for, his body and his experience are very anxious. So that unaccounted for anxiety that we would think a person would have in his current situation does actually come through. And that's why we do multiple rating scales. So I'm going to talk a bit about a specialized way in which we assess the brain that's very intimately related to our psychological understanding of an individual, and that's called quantitative electroencephalography, or QEEG. We colloquially refer to it as QEEG at Yellowbrick. And I'm going to give you a little basic primer on EEG and interpreting QEEG. And I will try to make it as accessible as I can for anyone who hasn't seen this sort of thing before. Okay. Our brains run on electricity all the time, as long as we're alive. The neurons in our brain are firing. They're communicating with each other through electrical charges and chemical discharges. All those neurotransmitters you hear about, norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, the release of those neurotransmitters and their uptake by the next cell is initiated through an electrical charge in the neuron. And that electricity happens in a range of frequencies, just like you would turn the dial on a radio to get a different station. All those stations are at different frequencies. Well, brain waves operate at different frequencies as well. And there's a wide range of those frequencies, and they're all happening all the time in everyone's brain. As long as you're walking around talking to other people and functioning, that's what's going on in your brain. And here are 4 examples of different frequencies in the brain. So if you look at could people nod if you can see my cursor here on this slide? Okay, great. So the frequency is how many of these waves are there in a given slice of this chart here. So the time interval is from left to right, and the power is up and down. And the number of these waves, up and down waves, per unit time is equivalent to the frequency. So delta is a very low frequency. Here's a wave, here's a wave, here's a wave. So that's around 1 to 3 waves per second, also called 1 to 3 cycles per second, or 1 to 3 hertz. To give you a comparison, if you turn on an FM radio, which you might have heard of, we used to have them everywhere, and you tune it to 91.1, that's 91.1 million hertz 91.1 million cycles per second. This is 3 cycles per second. It's pretty slow. This is more like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 cycles per second. This is about 8 to 12 cycles per second, and up here is in the 30 to 40 range. Gamma would be quite a bit higher, maybe 50. So these are all brain waves, and they're all measured from the same person's brain, but they're at different frequencies. So that's important. It turns out that different frequencies in different parts of the brain are associated with different brain functions. And if you only remembered one thing from me talking about that slide, that would be the thing to remember. Different frequencies in different parts of the brain connect with different kinds of brain functions. Okay, please do not try to memorize everything that's on this slide. I haven't, I don't think I could, but it's really presented to show you exactly how complicated the brain is. Brains are very, very complicated. I showed you 4 different frequencies. Now here are about 12 or 13 different frequencies. Here are all the locations on the head where we measure the brain waves, so we can figure out where are these brainwave differences happening. Here's a statistical map of the brainwave findings. This is putting all the frequencies together on the same graph. It's intended to be a way too busy slide just to show you how complicated this is. And it's only one view of the complexity. Our brains are incredibly complicated. And here is what we actually get out of measuring brain waves with quantitative EEG. This is a brain map, and this is Gio's brain map. And this is looking at 2 different frequency ranges. So on this map, which is actually using the MRI, that's a standard brain scan of a volunteer as the background, that gray area here and here, and a little bit of gray in here. This all comes from an individual who's not Gio, and it just helps us locate anatomically where are Gio's brainwaves having trouble. Then the colors, which do come from Gio's brain map, are showing us where in the brain are the areas of dysregulated brain function. And where it's red, it's extremely dysregulated. How do we know that? Because the computer has compared Gio's brainwaves to a big database of lots and lots of, meaning tens of thousands of normal volunteers and their brainwaves. And if you remember statistics, there's something called a z-score. This means that Gio's brainwaves, where these crosshairs meet, in each of these maps, it's actually the same location seen from 3 different angles. Gio's brainwaves are 4 standard deviations away from the average normal brainwave. 4 standard deviations, that means he's different than about 99.999999725. I made the number up, but it's a very, very high number. He's different from that percentage of the normal population. This is not normal brain function. And this is occurring in a part of his brain that has a particular function. It's a little bit toward the back, because this is a top-down view. It's on the right. This is a view from the back. And it's pretty up high here. So this would be roughly in his right parietal lobe. And by knowing what the right parietal lobe does, and what happens when people have this kind of severely dysregulated brainwave function, we can predict what kinds of symptoms Gio would be having. And that can actually help us to know what to do about them. We have a few different technologies that can help us address that. This one also shows a different kind of representation, but these dark blue areas correspond to Gio can't soothe himself. Alpha waves help us soothe ourselves. If you sit down and meditate, you are going to generate more alpha waves. If you just sit quietly and close your eyes, you are likely going to generate more alpha waves. Alpha waves are associated with calming ourselves down. And Gio is in a chronic state of being upregulated, agitated, anxious, excited, frustrated. So that's actually shown over here with the beta. But the parts of the functions of his brain that would serve to calm this down are underpowered. They're not working very well. That's what the blue means. So why is this important? Well, I told you about this already. He's got a verbal performance split. Why is it important that we know about what his brain's doing? Because in order to do effective treatment, we have to sequence the treatment that we're doing. I'm going to skip through. I'm going to get back to that. I'm going to get back to the sequencing in just a minute. So here's some of his other testing. You can see the big difference. I mean, this is not a low IQ, but it's much lower than the verbal. And he has, across the board, trouble with various parts of executive functioning, especially processing speed. He's from an overachieving family, and he's not able to overachieve because of some of these obstacles. Various areas of his executive functioning, this is a Cambridge University-based cognitive test, CANTAB, are not online adequately. He's having a lot of trouble with them. We checked his genes. Why check genes? Because they can help us to manage medications and supplements and know something about risks. I'm going to call your attention to this gene. I'm just going to call it CACNAC because it's easier to pronounce. And it has to do with the irritability of his neurons, and that has to do with mood instability. He has a finding that makes him very high risk for bipolar disorder and other kinds of mood instability. So what about our psychological formulation? Well, we know a lot about his brain. We know something about his genetics. We know that he's got some trouble with his verbal performance split and his executive functioning. Well, what is he actually like as a person? Because none of those tests tell us anything about what he's like as a person. Well, we know that he has been trying to please his father his whole life, and he's never felt like he could. And his father really values business success. So what did Gio decide to do? He went into business, selling drugs. And I don't mean that he was a pharma rep. He actually had the beginnings of a thriving business, although it's a pretty dangerous one, selling illicit drugs on a college campus. And so he was failing and succeeding at the same time. He's trying to go to college and flunking out, but starting to make money selling drugs, thinking his dad would appreciate that. But of course, his dad didn't appreciate it at all. The more he acts out, the more he does dangerous things or self-defeating things, the more his mother gets anxious and worried and starts to get more controlling and influencing. She tries to direct him, and she's sneaking around trying to get information about his activities. When she catches him, she shames him and humiliates him. She takes control of money that might otherwise go to him. So he's living with this profound shame all the time. I've let down my father. I can't succeed in school, and I have my mother controlling my life. How am I going to be a grown man? And this is a family that has a history of secretive, colluding alliances, patterns of deception. In response to the deception, Gio becomes defiant. He tries to get out. He can't sustain himself in the world well enough to successfully get out. So there's a cycle of in and out of the family. And the main developmental task of an emerging adult, of course, is to separate, individuate, become independent, and attempt to maintain some kind of different relationship that is supportive with one's parents. And Gio is having failure after failure in trying to do this. So Gio's core enactment, as we began to understand it, was that he's secretive, deceptive, withholding of important information. He rejects help. He has to be the expert. So he had done a lot of research on drugs, medications, supplements. And when he would meet with his psychiatrist, he'd explain to the psychiatrist why the psychiatrist didn't really know what he was doing, that Gio knew much better about psychopharmacology. In fact, he was an expert and a businessman. And so we should respect his opinion about these things. And of course, most of his information was distorted and inaccurate. He can't accept help because it means he's weak. He has to be the expert. He spent a lot of time working out, bulking up, getting very muscular, feeling more powerful, which we understood. Of course, that's not entirely unhealthy, but his drive to do it was driven much by shame and feeling chronically misunderstood and misperceived, and then going underground with it. And we also use the term core enactment sometimes to refer to the family's ways of dysfunctioning together, but it has its genesis. Some of these themes and approaches have their genesis within his family. He would equate, as other families did, deceptiveness with power. I hold the power because I hold the information and you can't have it. Again, needing help means vulnerability and shame, so as to be avoided. Dealing with inadequacy with the bulking up by being the expert, and so forth. So what does it feel like to work with someone like Geo? And now we're talking about the enactment experience. So this slide originally came from Geo's therapist, who had 3 times a week, 45 minutes each session to learn about what it's like to sit with Geo and have these kinds of conversations. And the experience was that no matter what you offer, it's no help. You're of no use to him. In fact, help feels shaming, so I have to do it myself. I act like I already know it all. If I tell the truth, then I lose. And these map onto the therapist's experience. I am helpless to help you because you reject everything and you know better. I end up feeling shamed by your criticism and condemnations of what I'm trying to do to help you. I want to prove myself to you. I want to prove that I actually know what I'm doing and I can help you, but you keep telling me I'm wrong. And if I tell you the truth, I lose the connection with you because you don't want to hear it. So in each of the ways that Geo experiences himself, the therapist begins to experience himself. And that's how we understand enactment. Except for Geo, defining these kinds of experiences in such an explicit way would be a stretch because these are dissociated aspects of himself. There are ways in which he has experience that is mainly behaved rather than talked about. And psychotherapy that is based on core enactment and on enactment has the purpose of bringing to consciousness these dissociated self-states, which of course sounds a lot simpler than it is, like all psychotherapy. It's easy to describe a model, it's harder to use it. A way to understand enactment is that it's countertransference as an identification with dissociated parts of the patient's experience. So Geo helps the therapist to, we use the word taste, what it's like to be Geo, inadequate, powerless, helpless. Of course, behaviorally, his deception undermines treatment, impedes progress. His drug use certainly impedes progress because whatever emotional states he's trying to quell with the drugs are then not available to the treatment. And the drugs also endanger him, and his selling drugs endangers him even more because of the people he deals with, chiefly the people he deals with to buy them. His fragile narcissism makes it very difficult to acknowledge realistic limitations. If you say, it looks like you have trouble with this, all he feels is shame. He doesn't want to talk about it. He doesn't want to admit it. And at the same time, and this is very interesting to me, through the course of his treatment, he was with us for a period of months. I think it was about 4 or 5 months, actually. He did become less suicidal. He did become less socially anxious. He had some engagement with his peers at Yellowbrick that did increase somewhat over time. And he had a somewhat increased capacity to speak about the things that made him angry, particularly within his family. So all the while resisting and continuing to act out, continuing to engage in these behaviors that we understood as communications of his powerlessness and shame. And despite his best efforts, I would say, he gained something from treatment because all he wanted to do was reject what we had to say. And even Geo himself could say at the end of his treatment, this was not a total waste of time. He certainly was not laudatory, but he could see that it wasn't a waste. So again, within the approaches in the psychotherapy are the balancing between mirroring, as Kohut often referred to, being willing to simply be with the person in their emotional experience, and then interpretation, which is more confrontational and challenging, using the countertransference as a way to empathize, including empathizing with states the patient is not fully aware of. There was some coaching going on. It's not typical in a more analytically oriented psychotherapy to do coaching, but for Geo, it was appropriate and it was included. A constant encouragement to use words instead of behaviors, and some teaching. I think most of this occurred more in the family therapy about conflict resolution, ways to sort out differences in the family without going underground, becoming more secretive. Again, there was some degree of movement in these areas of focus, but I would not say a full transformation. So what does this presentation and the Yellowbrick model have to do with private practice? Why talk about it with people whose main activity may be private practice? Give me a moment to catch myself up here. There we go. Well, it turns out that core enactment and the concept of enactment are applicable to all therapeutic relationships. In fact, they're applicable to all relationships, not just in psychotherapy. If you start using this on your friends, you may bump into some tensions and conflict, but the enactment experience exists in all relationships, including relationships between animals or between people and animals. When you look at your dog and you feel joy and your dog is wagging their tail and panting and pawing all over you and wants to jump in your lap, that's an enactment. Dogs have limbic systems. We have limbic systems. They talk to each other. In fact, we've bred them for thousands of years to be able to talk to us better in that way. We've selected the dogs who are better at that. When it comes to people, it's a lot more complicated, but it has its basis in a similar brain function. There's a frame of reference that is calling attention to a lot of different ways in which we and our patients are influenced by and influence each other, at least initially without knowing that it's happening. That's part of the basis of understanding enactment. So one challenge to try to use this in private practice that we actually have a little bit of an advantage, sometimes a big advantage about at Yellowbrick, is that, excuse me, I was in practice for close to 25 years. It was mostly a solo private practice, and I would see people. This was in Hinsdale. I would see people, sometimes a couple times a week, and they would come in and they would work really hard in therapy, and they'd tell me whatever they felt willing to tell me, and we'd work on it, and we'd struggle through the difficult moments, and they'd go home for the other 166 hours a week, and I have no idea what they were doing that they didn't tell me about. Occasionally, I'd find out later, because they didn't tell me about it till much later, or I'd find out because a spouse would call me, do you know what they did? What good are you doing with my husband, wife, et cetera, et cetera. So it turns out we actually don't have a whole lot of access to behavior in private practice, which is why people with the most serious challenges behaviorally tend to end up in more intensive treatments if they're lucky. But behavioral disturbance is not always talked about in psychotherapy unless your patient decides to talk to you about it. And there are all kinds of techniques we can all use to encourage that, to facilitate it, to make it feel safer, so people are more willing, but we don't have any control over it. And there's no reason we should. It's just the nature of doing practice, on an outpatient basis. The advantage we have at Yellowbrick, and we need that advantage to work with a population so challenging, is that people come to Yellowbrick, they come here, they are themselves. There's nothing controlled about their environment. We have agreements, we don't have rules. And they live with each other. Many of them live in a supported residence that's nearby the treatment center. And they spend a lot of time with each other and with us. And outside their therapy sessions, they do all sorts of things. And for the most part, we know what they're doing because it's all open and transparent. If they go out and drink, we know it. If we don't know it immediately, we usually know it eventually. If they decide to hook up with another peer who's in the program, we usually find that out too. We're not perfect, but we're pretty good at that. We don't have to be detectives because they're generally not that great at hiding it. And we can use that behavior as the basis for interpretation because the behaviors often have to do with those core issues. In fact, almost always they do. And so the difference in being a therapist at Yellowbrick compared to being a therapist in an outpatient practice is you don't introduce issues into private therapy in an office unless they're about time or money, which often are what people act out about. But then they're acting out with you. But you don't have the information to introduce issues that come from you. We have lots of information. And so our therapists are all authorized to bring the information in when and if the patient doesn't. because otherwise we're missing really important communication that's coming from them to our treatment team. They just may not be choosing to talk about it in the session. And we particularly are authorizing ourselves to do that when it's so-called misbehavior, behavior that transgresses community standards like substance use, coupling with other patients, lying to each other, engaging in treatment undermining behaviors. We interpret all that behavior. And it gives the tool of enactment and enactment interpretation much, much more power in, again, a population where it's sorely needed because they haven't had that kind of opportunity before. So let's go back to Geo. Geo particularly liked opiates. Why is that important? Well, if you've worked with people who use opiates and abuse opiates, I think you will repeatedly find that they have something they're really angry about. Because I'll tell you, there is not a better treatment for rage than an opiate. You go from feeling like you're going to explode to feeling fine in an instant. There's nothing more soothing for rage than heroin or fentanyl or some other opiate. The main difference between opiates is their potency. There are a few other more subtle differences. They're all really dangerous, and there's an awful epidemic going on that is the subject of at least 24 other talks. But suffice it to say, when we see someone who's having trouble with opiates, we are thinking, what are they mad about? And Geo had a lot to be mad about. We understood that. His involvement with drugs, not only opiates, was very severe. It was diagnosable in the DSM as severe disorders of several drugs, related to several drugs. And working with people who are using drugs to that extent means we're also dealing with danger all the time, because especially with opiates, you never know when someone's going to overdose, and when he was selling them, you never know when his dealer's going to, say he shortchanged him and shoot him. So this is another thing, because we're dealing with a high-risk population, we kind of have to hold hands together as a staff to manage that risk. There's a trauma history with Geo. There had been violence in his past. There was violence related to the drug dealing. So that's part of his history. It's just a lot of risk, violence, and trauma. Again, I talked about this earlier. This is the function of the brain that would soothe him. This is the function of the brain that makes him much more anxious. So he's got he's got a lot of anxiety and a limited capacity to calm it down. This trauma in the family, there had been violence in the family. There's the trauma of his inpatient treatment. What I mean by lifestyle here is the drug culture and drug dealing. Actually, Yellowbrick was created in part to give people who have these high risks an alternative to hospitalization. It's not the case that we never hospitalize anyone. We do, but it's very rare. We have a very high threshold, and we're basically more trusting of the relationship as the protection against suicide and other self-endangering activities than, I would say, than are many treatment facilities, but we're more trusting of it than one could be in a private practice, because we have a lot more resources and support to bring to bear within those relationships. But we do not call 911 the moment someone says to us, I'm suicidal. In fact, we see that as an opportunity to bring resources to bear, offer more support, ask someone to come into our residence if they're not already there. We do a lot to help people through these crisis moments so we can harvest the emotional information that's in those moments to use in their treatment, and not send them off to a hospital where they're likely to have a traumatic experience, because it's the nature of hospitalization these days. Some are better than others, for sure, but getting hospitalized means you're going to be run through a very quick process of crisis stabilization where there is no opportunity to form relationships. And you're going to meet 15 or 20 different people who ask you the same questions over and over, You may be put in restraints. You may have security guards who are jumpy and worried and overreactive. There's all kinds of opportunities to get traumatized again when a person gets hospitalized. So we really try to avoid it. Again, one of the reasons Yellowbrick was created was to be an alternative for many of those hospital situations. And in Gio's case, this had been a specific trauma. He was very affected by his hospitalization. So if we're doing all these processes, maybe we ought to do them in the right order. I don't know if you can see the caption. It says, hang on, we must be doing something wrong. How does the saying go? It says the horse pushing the cart. Well, we try to sequence a number of different things, and we actually give some thought to this and do our best to do them in the right order to the best of our ability to understand it. So first, the limbic system is the emotional brain. You saw the shape that Gio's limbic system is in. We understand that to be the result of trauma and the result of the ongoing conflict, trauma, rage between him, excuse me, and his family. And we understand that to be the default state of his brain. So even when he's sitting around looking calm, his brain is still running on overdrive. So anything we can do to quiet the limbic system, we will attempt to do as long as a person's willing to participate. We have something called neurofeedback, where you can see those brain images or a cartoon or video game version of them on a screen. And by meditating, you can calm them down. And you can actually watch your brain change in real time by playing a video game with your mind as the controller. They don't hold any gadget in their hands to do that. And it's very effective over time, and it's very well attended. People tend to actually enjoy it, but they're actually changing their brains when they do it. We have transcranial magnetic stimulation, which can treat severe depression, anxiety, OCD by stimulating the brain with an electromagnet. It's an FDA-approved treatment for all those conditions. We use it very widely because a lot of our patients have anxiety, depression, or some variant of OCD, if not OCD. We use cognitive rehabilitation to help people be able to think more clearly, to think through problems, so they can use skills like CBT that many of them have learned elsewhere and continue to learn with us. We have mindfulness meditation at the beginning and end of every group experience at Yellowbrick, so people become fluent in mindful meditation. And the most effective thing to quiet the limbic system is relationships, because people co-regulate each other. It's what mothers and babies do, but all people do it with each other in some way when they are supportive relationships. So that comes first, because if you're going to do provocative psychotherapeutic interventions, I'm going to push you to be aware of parts of your experience that your brain has worked for years to keep out of your consciousness. That is an uphill battle, and you don't want me to do that. And if your brain is really on fire, you're going to fight me tooth and nail. So we try to do the quieting first before we push too hard in the psychotherapy. And then we kind of cycle between the two over time. What we don't do, what you don't see on here in the first 3 steps, is family therapy. But I'll get to that in a minute. So core enactment, the acting out of the core enactment, that person's repeating patterns of how they engage dysfunctionally with others, interferes with treatment, and as it has been interfering with their life, driving dysfunction. So he's on his way out the door and he says, my prefrontal cortex still loves you, but my amygdala just booked a one-way ticket to Fiji. The amygdala is the fight or flight, deeply emotional, automatic part of the brain. It is where trauma gets reenacted. I'm oversimplifying a bit, but it's deeply involved in flashbacks and reenactments of trauma. And it's the part of your brain that saves you from the saber-toothed tiger. But it's also the part of the brain that drives the guy to book the flight to Fiji when he had a fight with his wife. Even though his prefrontal cortex says, maybe I ought to stick around. Prefrontal cortex is the thinking part of the brain, the part that remembers they fell in love and they had good times in their marriage and this fight isn't the end of the world. but his amygdala took over. What happens is your emotional brain hijacks the rest of your brain, and it makes decisions that sometimes people later regret. And that's why sequencing is important. We want to calm his amygdala down so that the next time he has a fight, he won't necessarily book that flight of, spending all his money flying to Fiji and not have enough to come back. So what else quiets the limbic system? Sobriety. I could have written that 6 or 7 times. It's so important. It's so difficult. If you've ever tried to change a habit you don't like, even a minor one, and noticed how difficult that is, how your whole being seems to resist it. And for anyone who has not been addicted to a drug, just try to imagine that multiplied exponentially. That's what it's like to attempt to establish and maintain sobriety. And if you're trying to do it alone, as they say where I come from, forget about it. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to do alone. I talked about the neuromodulation and the cognitive rehab. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is the more specific way of naming what that cartoon character was saying about his frontal cortex. It's an area of the brain that has a lot of responsibility in executive function, including executive emotional function, that is the thinking brain's ability to calm down the emotional brain. And medication, relationships, things like TMS can all help to enhance the function of the DLPFC. And learning life skills. And for Gio, this was especially important. And as I recall, he did not love meeting with our occupational therapist. And a lot of patients who have trouble with executive function and life skills do not like meeting with their occupational therapist because the occupational therapist is focusing entirely on life skills and occupation, how you spend your time. OT, for those who may not be familiar, does not mean finding you a job. It could include aspects of the search and the effort, but it's not actually job coaching. I'm an expert on OT as much as you can be without being an OT because I married one. So I can tell you what happens when people sit down with the OT, our people at Yellowbrick, is they're shamed. And just the prospect of it makes them not even want to make the appointment. But once they do sit down, they can enhance their life skills if they're willing to sit there long enough to find out. And that can actually help them have an experience of success, which can help them with their own emotional management. This is a person, Gio, who didn't have a lot of success other than as a drug salesman. He would have said salesman, I say dealer. Here's the DLPFC, front of the brain, back of the brain, spinal cord, frontal cortex, and then the blue area is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And if this part of your brain is not working, changing, very active, treatment of Yellowbrick is really hampered. What about medications? Well, medications are a problem for somebody who thinks he knows a lot more about medication than you do, no matter who you might be, especially if you're a psychiatrist. So part of the problem is, the challenge, I should say, at Yellowbrick is our psychiatrists are psychotherapists. We have to understand what's getting in the way of the medication management. And for our staff psychiatrist, he has to do that in a half hour. It is a half hour every week. Sometimes it's twice a week if things are changing and moving a lot. It's not a half hour every 3 months, like most psychiatry is out in the world. But still, it can be very challenging, especially with Gio. He had issues of power and authority. Only one of the people in that room can write a prescription for a psychiatric drug. Shame and inadequacy, and he was compensating for that by insisting that he knew more. And of this dependency, as soon as you take a pill that was given to you by someone else on their authority, you are now dependent, and in his view, you are weak. And he wasn't having it. And I don't remember if he ever accepted any medication. I think the answer is no. But our psychiatrist kept at it, kept trying. So part of this sequence of quieting the limbic system and then doing the things that are more provocative is attempting to develop some kind of alliance, some kind of agreement that we're actually here for a common purpose. And that leads to a more uncovering psychotherapy.
looking at the feelings between therapist and patient through the lens of enactment, and then interpreting the enactment and core enactment related behaviors in and outside of the therapeutic dyad. That's what I was referring to earlier, where behaviors can be interpreted even if the patient did not choose to bring them into the conversation. And then tying those interpretations to developmental factors. Well, we might understand this particular behavior that you engaged in with the other patients at Yellowbrick of keeping a secret from them about something you knew that was happening in the community as having to do with your family's culture of secrecy and how that was the only way you had power in your family. That would be an example of interpretation. Here we are, family work, family therapy. At Yellowbrick, we generally do not do family therapy until at least 4 to 6 weeks into treatment. And the reason is these families, by and large, even the families that have very dedicated, loving parents who have really been doing their best, and we're not talking about, psychopathic, uncaring parents who don't care about their kids. We hardly ever run into that, really. They are having a lot of trouble, and they've all been traumatized by the mental illness, and they often have been traumatized by the healthcare system, and they're all pretty brittle and fragile. And if we try to go into family therapy from day one without the patient knowing that we have their back, and they have some sense of alliance with us, and the parents too, we often are setting ourselves up for their failure and ours. So we delay it. We give the parents full access to a family liaison 24/7 through that 4 to 6 weeks and beyond. But we do not attempt to put them all in the same room with the therapist. When we do family therapy, we do it with the family liaison and the therapist, who we call the advocate. The advocate is there to advocate for treatment, which of course doesn't always mean advocating for what the patient wants. Then later in treatment, and we're now getting to latter stages, we have career and education counseling. We have found that people who attempt to find part-time work or volunteer or take a class or two while they're still in some level of treatment at Yellowbrick have greater success with those activities after Yellowbrick. So that's, but that's usually something people are not ready to take on until they've done some of the more intensive work. We talked about the core enactment and how it's treatment interfering and drives dysfunction. We talked about Gio's cognitive limitations. He was a very willful person, very stubborn. We're pretty stubborn too about our principles. So there was plenty of headbutting in his treatment. His particular core enactment was disempowering of others. There was a lot of deception. He also was a person who tended to be very preoccupied with his bodily experiences and physical symptoms, which again is one of the ways we understood that he didn't report anxiety, but he experienced it. And we talked about the instability of his mood that has some genetic basis. This was not the most collaborative person we ever worked with. But all of that exists on a spectrum, and I would not say he was completely non-collaborative. It was somewhere in the middle. We've talked about this already. Difficulty, self-soothing. He had trouble with problem solving, and it wasn't only with standardized cognitive tasks or academics. He had trouble problem solving in relationships. If you sat down with Gio and you said, well, what's the trouble with this peer you're having a conflict with? Well, they hate me. Well, why do they hate you? Well, I don't know. I have no idea. Well, what do you think you could do about it? I don't know. And even if you got him to pause, he couldn't come up with much on his own. So that's what I mean by this is an executive function and executive emotional functioning discrepancy. We talked about the dishonesty, deception, and secret keeping. One of our community agreements is people agree not to keep secrets. That's partly because it's just very undermining to relationships and treatment. It's also because in our population, it's dangerous and can even be life-threatening. If the secret is about somebody's drug use, it can be particularly dangerous. What we did find we were able to get to with Gio was that he wasn't just mad at his father, he missed him. And he felt, in some ways pushed out by his sisters and by his mom because everyone wanted dad's attention and he wasn't getting as much of it as he wanted or needed. His bad kid identification drew his father's involvement in a certain way that it kind of held his father hostage so that he couldn't really ignore him. And of course, it made everyone feel powerless, another manifestation of that part of his core nature. We talked about having to have a business, but it was a very distorted way of identifying with his father. So we have a lot of different elements to our treatment at Yellowbrick. We have roughly 15 to 18 professional staff with various disciplines. People's schedules when they come to treatment are very busy. We don't know when we start what's going to be the thing that clicks for that individual. So we offer them everything. And it's not helter skelter. We do have a plan and we have a timing, an idea of timing, at least what we recommend. And there are certain specialty involvements and groups that we will recommend for some and not others. But the overall most effective part of treatment is the immersion, the intensity, the opportunity to let relationships deepen. And the idea that we will know ahead of time which part of this menu of treatments is going to have the most bang for the buck for that individual is really arrogant in my view. That until we know someone really well, we don't have that idea. And then eventually we may develop it and then we emphasize that part of it. So for some, we go in and think, boy, family therapy is the way to go. But we always try to get more information before we jump into it. We've had people have 3, 4, 5 times a week family therapy for periods of time when that just appears to be the most powerful tool. And then for some, there's no point to family therapy because no one's willing. None of the family are willing to sit in a room together, sometimes ever. So people often surprise us, and they surprise us in both directions. The change can often occur in unpredictable ways. And a really important part of this is we use evidence-based treatments. You have to recognize that when you're working with a treatment refractory, multiply diagnosed population with high risks, no one has done research on our population. Our population would not qualify for a research study. Research studies are done on people with one diagnosis, without a complication of substance abuse, or with only substance abuse, if that's a thing. And so we treat the people who wouldn't be eligible for the research trials. So we have to use our best judgment to apply evidence-based research to a population who are not the basis for the research that supplies the evidence for the treatment. And we have a pretty good success rate, but of course, as I said at the beginning, it's not perfect. Some of the surprises are successes that we didn't expect, and some of the surprises are not so successful. It turns out that verbal skills alone, with his very high verbal IQ, they do not predict success in life. They certainly don't by themselves predict relational success, and they don't in this kind of treatment either. A big take home from this conversation and from the work we do is that the brain is not just complicated, but more complicated than we understand. And I fear that in my career, we're not going to get dramatically closer to a full understanding of the brain, but we're making progress every day. I'm in the latter part of my career. For people at the beginning of theirs, there may be more hope for that. What we understand is an approximation, and this whole process, patients, the brain, the work, are quite humbling. And if we can remember that, we can position ourselves to do some really good work. So this is a partial map of 10 neurons, 10 nerve cells. And it's only partial. And the number of neurons in your brain is measured in the hundreds of millions. Each neuron has, on average, about 7,000 connections to other neurons. So that's why when you hear this statement, there are more synapses in the human brain than there are stars in the universe. It's not an exaggeration. That's how complicated our brains are. That's what we're working with. It's important, even if you're not drawn to neuroscience, even if you don't use this kind of neuroscience in your day-to-day work, remembering that can, I think, really give you a perspective on what the work you're doing is and what it is you're actually dealing with, because we're all dealing with this, no matter what type of practice we have. If we're working with mental health problems, this is what we're working with. And of course, we're working with people who are even more complicated. Sorry, I was wrong. It's 100 billion neurons. Glial cells are another type of cell that we've only recently started learning about their role. I said about 7,000. Yeah. So, and this is measured in a 3-year-old whose brain is not fully developed. So I'll read the caption for you. What was initially thought to be a simple process is in fact an incredibly complicated, intricate, and complex system that I've codified and organized into a few easy to follow rules that are more difficult to implement than you'd think. And that's really what this work is like. And personally, I find it endlessly challenging, fascinating, and gratifying, and also wildly frustrating at times. So I'm happy to talk with you more about anything that's been part of this or related questions. And thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Barron. So I'm going to ask you a question, and as you know, we're talking, hopefully people in the audience can think about how this might apply to some of the work they've done or to their experience with a patient or a client. But one of the advantages that we have at Yellowbrick, as you know, is that there are different professionals have different roles in the patient's treatment. So, the therapist or the advocate has one experience with the patient, but then also the patient has a relationship with other people, like the medical director. And so I was wondering if you can recall, for you, what was your experience with Geo, and what was futile for you to try and resist?
I think it was, I'll tell you, this is not a cognitive memory, so it's very fitting with the idea of enactment, because my cognitive memory of that is not as accessible as I'd like it to be. But I do have an emotional memory. And my emotional memory is very clear. And I would say the most challenging thing for me with Gio was how angry I got at him. Because he was so defeating of all our efforts. And my experience of that in a not entirely rational way, this is not how I would, this is only part of how I would speak to him about such things, is that we have so much to offer here. There's so much here that could actually make a difference in your life. And your choice is to reject almost all of it. And at the same time, I recognized he wasn't rejecting everything, but when I confronted that part of his experience, I would get really angry. And the way I would understand that in terms of his core enactment is, this guy was walking around angry all the time. In fact, he was struggling to manage his anger in all kinds of mostly dysfunctional ways. And I think the way he would engage with me, which was a bit indirect, he actually didn't get into much administrative trouble where I had a lot of direct interactions with him, but I'm personally involved in everyone's treatment to some extent, would communicate to me just how much he was stewing all of it. So what I would do with that information, had I had more opportunity, would be to say, hey, Gio, I think I know something about what it's like to be you by what it's like to be with you. Because I feel undermined, I feel helpless, and I feel mad about it. And I think that was his day-to-day experience in his family growing up.
So you said that as he was leaving, you said, well, this wasn't a total waste of time.
Yeah, it was high praise. High praise. I don't remember if those were his exact words, but he did say something to that effect. He actually thanked his advocate at the end of treatment. I do remember that. Even though, he didn't see it as totally successful, but he was appreciative of what he did get out. As I recall, it's 6 years ago now, but I'm pretty sure he left kind of abruptly, but stayed, he allowed enough of a process to thank his advocate and say something about that there was some use to this treatment, even though he was still very dismissive of many parts of it.
What would you say that what do you think he would think he got out of treatment?
It's a great question. I think he would have felt slightly more effective in his relationship, slightly more like he would know a little better when he was mad, and he would have a little better skill set about how to use words to express it. Not by any means that was a transformational change, but I think he acquired some skills and started to use them a bit in that regard. And I think his family got some, at least, information on what wasn't working for all of them, including that Geo had some information as well. So I think they were headed to at least one more crisis before things might change in a more fundamental way. And my guess is multiple other crises. Unfortunately, for people like Geo, people don't always survive those crises because of the particular behavioral choices he was making.
Yeah.
And also, unfortunately for us, we don't always get follow-up information. We've attempted to do follow-up surveys, and by and large, the response rate is very, very low, and it doesn't really give us useful data, from a statistical point of view. So the information we have about follow-up is all patient-initiated or family-initiated. And, we work with a very high-risk population. We've had a few really pieces of tragic news, but mostly the people who get in touch with us later are the successes, and we've had quite a few of those, including some who really hated our guts when they were with us.
There's some that sometimes when they leave, we think, boy, did we blow that one? and then they come, a year later, it's like, wow.
Who are you? Yes, we have quite a few of those experiences. I think, the other thing that's really humbling about this work is everyone who's in this field, we'd like to think, even if we know it doesn't fully make sense, that when we work with this person, when I work with this person, when Yellowbrick works with this person, that's the thing that's going to really make the difference. And their life is going to turn around and everything's going to be great from here. Even if we know better, if you have no hope, why would you engage in such difficult work? But I think we have to have the humility to realize that, especially for the folks we work with, it's probably heightened for our population, that they may have a really messy, difficult experience that provides very little gratification for them or us between the beginning and the end of their involvement with us. And they had 3 before us, and they're going to have 2 after us. And it may be with the last one that actually things start to turn around. So I'll tell you an experience I had. I'll do it without identifying anyone. I was out at a social event, and before the event, a now retired staff member from Yellowbrick, one of the leadership, and myself went out to a restaurant. And we're sitting in the restaurant waiting for our dinner. One of the waiters walks up to us and he says, "Hey, Dale, Dr. Barron, John Smith, Yellowbrick class of 2012. Remember me?" And boy, did I remember him. This guy was deeply addicted to heroin. He was on Suboxone when he came to us. He was angry, angry, angry all the time. He and his father could barely sit in a room together. He did so many things to undermine his treatment. He was constantly critical of Yellowbrick. He hated us. He hated his peers. He hated everyone. He would sit in the corner of the community meeting, criticizing, mumbling under his breath. He just drove everyone crazy, and we did not have a lot of hope about it. And he left in a messy way. And partly by being financially cut off by his father, who got sick of him. We're at this restaurant. He says, things got a lot worse after I left that place. And it went on for a while. And then I got sober. And then after a while, I realized, hey, I can use that stuff I learned at Yellowbrick. And he totally turned his life around.
He stayed sober. He got a job. He had a girlfriend. He had an apartment that he was paying for. He was happy. And I don't even aim for happy. Like, I think, joy is a nice thing. Happiness is kind of overrated. But he was doing well and very grateful. And I would never, if you had asked me if I was going to have this conversation 4 or 5 years later, or whatever it was, I would have said no way. So we have all kinds of surprises. Occasionally they're very bad ones, but most of them are pleasant. And then there's a lot of people who just don't have information about.
I remember that case because I was the advocate.
Yes, I remember that too. You had one of the hardest jobs. Yeah.
What would you say the role of being coerced into treatment by his parents' financial power?
Yeah. Well, as you know, it's problematic, but it's also not that uncommon because we're working with emerging adults, and most of them are financially dependent on their parents. So on the one hand, we always hope and wish that that's not going to be the way someone enters treatment, that they're going to at least have their own willingness and not actually be coerced by their parents. But I would say that I'm sure that was an obstacle for Gio. I know it was an obstacle for Gio, but he did partially overcome it. And it's not been our experience that that moment ruins treatment for everybody. Because that moment doesn't always come up right at the beginning. Sometimes it comes up later on when someone's behaviors are persisting even while they're with us. And because we don't immediately kick people out when that happens, we sometimes enlist the parents and say, look, you have leverage that we don't. You can say, I won't support anything but Yellowbrick. So if you get kicked out of Yellowbrick, you're on the street. And that's often really helpful, even though it's painful and messy and people get mad at each other. But sometimes that anger that's coming out in that moment has been sitting there many years. And it's about time. We have had people go to homeless shelters and have the rude awakening that is part of what that accomplishes, and come back and say, okay, I get it. I got to do this work. So we had somebody slept in their car a few nights because they refused to go to a shelter, and came back and said, okay, I'm ready, I'll do it. And we've had other people who, they find a friend to crash with, they smoke some weed together and they just ignore it and they muddle their way through and leave. So it doesn't always work, but that leverage from parents for those who are financially dependent, sometimes it is the powerful tool that's needed at the right moment, and it's effective.
I mean, I've also experienced here some of the hardest struggles that some of our patients have is reckoning with the fact that their parents told them they have to be here, but then they have some sense that, well, maybe I really do want treatment anyway, and how to get themselves out from.
Yeah. How can it be my idea if it's also their idea?
Right.
That's just, it's infuriating to many of them. And it should be, it's their job at this age is to become separate. And it's a moment where they're confronting the fact that they're not yet capable of being separate. And it's very shameful, and they hate it, and they don't like being reminded of it. And our job is to help them get through the terrible moment, because otherwise they're not going to ever be able to be capable.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that is a tough reconciliation.
So again, I'm going to ask the audience, if they have reflections or questions or if disagreements.
I see one. I've got to pull up the chat here to see it fully. You talk a great deal about anger. I am someone who sees anger as a possible source of energy. Do you discuss ways to make anger constructive? All the time. At least we make our best efforts. I have to say that I wouldn't say I was a primarily conflict avoidant person before I came to Yellowbrick, but it has expanded my range of willingness for me. And I've been a therapist for many years and an administrator too. And
we are trying to help the patients experience anger as part of the conversation, not as itself a damage to the relationship. But many of them come from backgrounds where anger is damaging to the relationship because of the ways it gets expressed, because it's violent, because of any number of reasons. So there's a lot of resilience building to be had in experiencing the motivating energy of anger and having access to one's anger and aggression and being able to use it in a constructive way. And a lot of our patients, not all, some of them are quite comfortable being angry, but mostly they are very avoidant of it. So absolutely, it's a source of energy, and not having access to it is denervating. It's mostly those folks are very depressed and shut down, avoidant.
Now, I did not get that question, so apparently that was sent to you.
It was sent directly, yeah.
Yes, I don't know if there's any other questions that you have, or
I don't see any others at the moment. Let me double check. No, I don't. I mean, somebody wave at me or say something if I'm missing one. But, yeah, that's the only one I've got.
all right. So I'm gonna wait another 20 seconds or so. If not, we can wrap up. I mean, I can listen to this for another 2 hours easily. So. All right. Well, thank you.
I'm very grateful for the time, and thank you all for being here.
Yeah. And thank you to the audience. People stayed, and actually the audience grew by 2 during the course of the talk. So thank you everyone for joining us and being part of our colleagues and conversations.
And we're really looking forward to doing this in person before too much longer.
Yeah, I don't know if I said hoping for the May one to be in person.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, we really miss that limbic communication. It's just less accessible over Zoom, but we do the best we can, and we appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.
Bye-bye.